the series Cities of the Imagination, because I want to look at the narratives or the myths that cities have constructed about themselves and which endure today and which inform us and inform much of the tourist industry also as to what people are expecting to see and how they're going to conceptualise these particular cities. I want to, in this series, actually look at the way art, and by that I'm actually going to mean painting, because of course architecture would be another way of looking at it, or urban planning. I want to look at the way in which these cities have used art to construct images of themselves. And this would be in relation to Venice, which has constructed itself as the magical city. Amsterdam and Delft, in fact those cities in the Netherlands, who have constructed themselves as the great city of liberalism, and Paris, who constructed herself as the city of light. Now, when we sort of think of the great artists in relation to these cities, for example, if you think in relation to Venice, the Bellinis, Tintoretto, Titian, Veronese, or in the relation to Amsterdam, you think of Delft, Rembrandt. With Paris, you think of Pissarro, Monet, all of that group. You tend to sort of look at it in art historical terms and think of these artists as having sort of evolved in an artistic tradition, right? Or the fact that maybe their work stands alone as geniuses, you know, this concept of the great geniuses of art, which is constructed by Vasari. You also, or we also, tend to look at these artists in groups, you know, artists of the Baroque era or artists of the Impressionist era. And so what I really actually want to do today is to look at a different context in which to look at these images of the city. I want to look at them in a political context. And in fact, I'm going to put forward the idea that these cities actually deliberately construct myths about themselves at a time when they are entering a period of decline. And this, for example, we're going to investigate today in Venice, will be the 17th century in Venice. I'm going to look a little bit at the history of Venice to explain why I have this hypothesis. The Dutch Golden Age, you'd think these painters are actually at the peak of that particular period when this small country basically defeats, you know, the great fleets of the world. However, they are conquered by the French, and after that enter a period of decline, which again is sort of the late Baroque period. Paris, of course, in many ways enters a time of great anxiety, insecurity, loses in many ways its idea of identity after the Prussian War, Franco-Prussian War in 1871, when they lose part of French territory, Alsace and Lorraine. And this is the time when you have the Impressionist painters not concentrating at all on the horrors of what's gone on either in Paris or outside Paris, but with constructing this ideal city, which we go in our imagination to the city of light. So that's the way in which I'm going to look at these three groups of cities. And today, of course, we're going to be looking at Venice. And the myth that Venice constructs of itself evolves over time and is taken over by other groups of people. Briefly, it constructs the image of itself as the magical city around about in the 17th century. This myth is then taken over during its decline by the English grand tourists, who see it as a kind of melancholy city. And now we visit Venice as a kind of city of fragile treasure, right? And these are the sort of ways in which it still presents itself. So I'm looking at the myth of the Serenissima. I forgot to explain what that means. I mean, the most serene. This is the one of the epithets that Venice gives itself, this idea of having lasted forever and being the most serene of all republics. Now, I want to very briefly then just look at the history of Venice. I'm going to be investigating it further when we're talking about how it constructs this image or this narrative about itself. Venetian history could be roughly broken into 3 ages, from the time that it is theoretically founded in 421 on the day of the Annunciation, 25th of March at 12 o'clock, right up until the sort of when it becomes not just a city of fishermen and salt bearers, but a great merchant city which begins to dominate the Adriatic. And this goes up to the Great Crusade of 1204, led by the Doge Enrico Dandolo, who was blind and 95 when he actually takes part in the Fourth Crusade. Now, this was a time when all crusaders flooded to Venice because it was the closest point to which from which one could go out to reach Jerusalem. Well, of course, the Crusaders never reached Jerusalem because they were relying very much on the Venetian ships. And they had to pay for that Venetian shipping, and they didn't have enough money. And so the Venetians said, well, don't worry, we'll make up that shortfall, but let's make a little detour on the way into Constantinople. And in fact, they take all of the Crusaders with them, and this crusade is deviated by the Venetians to actually to sack Constantinople. And this, of course, is when all of these wonderful treasures will come back, one which adorn the outside of St. Mark's, and of course we get the horses of St. Mark's, which were taken from the racetrack in Constantinople. But it's not just these treasures that they gain something like 5/8 or something of the old Byzantine Empire. So now they now are mistresses or masters, whatever you want to call it, because Venice always markets herself as a woman, mistress of the seas, and they turn their attention now to the mainland. Great expansion takes place. However, there is a number of battles, a number of leagues of the other papal states, the Holy Roman Empire, Spain and the rest of Italy against Venice because of their encroaching nature. And finally Venice will be defeated, and this will be the Battle of Lepanto, I suppose, is the last great battle that Venice will take part in, actually on the side of the Spanish and the Austrians, to defeat the Turks, right? The Ottomans, who are advancing and are completely stopped by the Venetian fleet with the others. And this is the last great battle where rowing boats using oars, triremes, are used. From then on, all battles will be with sailing boats. So here we have what will now become typical of Venetian propaganda, because at this time that she's going to pull back from taking on any more land grabs or sea grabs, and gradually will shrink to basically the Venice that we know. Right, so here we have Veronese, who is one of the people who is always given the commission by the Council of Venice to paint the victory of the Battle of Lepanto. Now, as you will see, there is not a mention of the Spanish or of the Holy Roman Empire. This is the Virgin Mary, of course. Why? Because she's intimately connected with the myth of Venice, right? Because it was founded on the day of the Annunciation. Here is Venice with her dagger drawn and her crown slipping off her head. She is accompanied by St. Mark with his lion, St. Rocco, who is the great plague saint, and St. Peter with the keys. In other words, Venice is laying claim to have been the person who will re-establish Christianity or fortify the Pope with the help of St. Mark, and this has been done with their amazing ships. However, I think about the beginning of the 16th century, of course, Columbus finds the route to America, and so trade from the east and so on no longer needs to go via Venice. And the city gradually the commerce contracts and will gradually go into decline. And so by I think it's 97, Napoleon, who is a general in the head of the French Republican Army, not only invades but threatens Venice, and the last Doge votes to surrender. So in other words, theoretically 1,000 years of freedom ends with French domination, and here we have a painting of Napoleon who finally enters Venice in 1804 and proceeds to do what he did best, which is shut churches, set up cemeteries, and so on. And you have to remember that, of course, this comes from a Republican mindset. He sort of saw Venice as infested by the church. You know, every square had a couple of churches on it. He thought there were too many. All right, and so when people now roll their eyes and talk about Napoleon getting rid of it, he was trying to create a modern city. He sort of filled in some of the canals to make the city more navigable. So this then is this city, which will now, the myth now that was created of it being the city, magical city at the time of its decline, this myth is now taken up by other people who come to look at Venice. Venice is now visited by 30 million tourists a year. 30 million. And this is a phenomenon which is very recent. This quantity of people is very recent. It's because of the cruise ships. Each cruise ship will disgorge up to 9,000 people a day. They sail down the Giudecca. And each of these cruise ships will have a set itinerary. You go across from the Giudecca, you walk across to St. Mark's, you go to the palace, you go to St. Mark's, the Doge's palace, you go and have a pizza nearby, you walk around, buy a few bits and pieces, and walk back to the ship. So you don't really see any of the real Venice, you don't patronise any of the real sort of industries of Venice. It means that now there are something like, at the last census, there were 55,000 Venetians living in Venice, and by now it would probably be about 45. Right? So this then is a city which is in peril and it's imperiled by the myth that it has created. And this is the point I wanted. These people are now consuming the myth that Venice used for itself. And the Venetian Council overrode a mandate which had been put out by the Italian government saying that the cruise ship should not be allowed up the Giudecca. And the Venetian Council stopped it, even though this was against what the locals wanted, because it is so incredibly lucrative. However, Venice probably was always a great tourist destination. Firstly, because of the Crusades, as I mentioned before, people would come up to sail off on the Crusades, and they often would spend months there waiting for the correct conditions on the sea to go over to Jerusalem. This meant that there was a lot of lodging houses, there were restaurants, and of course there were a huge number of prostitutes, and this is the Venetian courtesans are going to be famous throughout the world. This legend, I think, as I mentioned in the introduction, is then taken up by the grand tourists, these are the Englishmen who at the age of 17 or 18 are going to spend 2 years abroad, making them, seeing the world and making themselves worthy of taking up a place in the House of Lords. And so they had to be experienced in resisting what was considered the vice of Venice. All right? They went to Rome to experience the horrors of papacy and Roman Catholicism. They went to Venice because Venice was seen as the most depraved city around. All right? So this is then the sort of melancholy, disintegrating city, but which receives thousands of these English tourists. In fact, that's where the word tourist comes from people of the Grand Tour. So having said that, let's turn back then to a a time before Venice was actually connected to the mainland. All right? So the railway bridge that connected Mestre to Venice was only made by the Austrians, I think, in 1864, very, very late, and a bridge was built even later, and then was taken over by the fascists at Fonte della Libertà. So this meant that when you arrived in Venice, up until then, you had to arrive by the sea, right? And so it was easy to construct myths as people sort of came in a boat which was on the level of the water. They weren't actually in gondolas, but they were in very low boats, and they would come across the lagoon, and the city would rise out of the water in front of them. All right, it was a city which was resplendent in marble. Right, the city of Venice, as you know it, has extraordinary exterior decorations, particularly around St. Mark's. As they came in, they would be absolutely bamboozled by the extraordinary richness and the exotic nature of the decorations going into St. Mark's, with the gold and the mosaics and the sort of the almost Eastern style of Catholic ritual which takes place. So there's this city which sort of magically arises out of the water. But it means several things also. First of all, these are people, the British, who've come from a sort of, stinking, smog-bound London. You've got the Parisians who've come from the unhygienic cobbled streets of Paris. And suddenly there are no streets, it's all water. And of course this means it's incredibly quiet, as opposed to the cacophony of the carts and the people yelling out their wares and people, accidents happening. There's suddenly this serenity with perhaps the gondolas singing in answer to each other across the canals. There's no dust, there's no clutter. And more than anything else, it's not a walled city, all right? Now, at this time, all cities were walled, including Paris. So it's not only that, but there is no evident police force. There is no army that seems to be enforcing what is going on. The other thing which is very disorienting about Venice is that it's not just out of space by rising out of the water, but it also seems to live in its own time capsule. Firstly, the Venetians used a 24-hour system instead of the 12-hour system, which was common elsewhere, which worked according to when the sun set. Right, so the sunset was the time that you used. So, for example, if you wanted to go to the theatre at 8 o'clock in the evening, in June that would be, 1 o'clock? Because the sun would set at 7. In winter, 8 o'clock in the evening for us would probably be 5, right? So people who had just come out of the other system had to get used to this extraordinary system. And as you go round Venice, particularly even in St. Mark's Square, you will still see that most of the old clocks that are there are 24-hour ones. Santa Apostoli, for example, has that. The other thing which was even more unsettling was the fact that the Venetians still used the old Julian calendar, and this meant that the year started in March. And so if someone arrived in February of 1777, they would find that they were actually in 1776 at a strange time in the afternoon. So in other words, what this actually meant that they'd entered a completely different sphere in every way, right? By time and space. The other thing that fascinated people, that made it so completely amazing, was the extraordinary number of processions and rituals, the way in which Venice wore its history on the outside, so as to speak. So there was always a public processions of days which always represented the greatness of Venice, But what amazed other people when they actually came to these processions was how orderly they were. And there were no people pushing and shoving. Everyone knew their place. There was a mixture of the high and the low. There was never any police. There was never any stealing. None of this sort of happened as it happens in Rome. And this was in fact because there was a very, very strong secret police which was greatly feared. So in other words, there was this whole sort of secret dimension behind this seemingly outward manifestation of pomp and glory, right? Which, again, was something which people weren't used to. They were used to the presence of police. So I want to now look at the myths that Venice actually wove about itself. And you will see that most of these, even though some of them date from right back at the beginning, some of them, most of them relate very much to this time of decline, and this is around the 1600s, the beginning of the 17th century. So I wanted to start with the marriage of Cana with Veronese, which I think is a very good example of this. Now, this was commissioned to be in the refectory of the monks on the Palladian church of San Giorgio, right? So this would mean that the monks, but many other people would see it because they would come out to visit San Giorgio. Now, theoretically, it's about an episode in the New Testament where Christ presides over a marriage at Cana, and it is the time of his first miracle. There's not enough wine, and so he turns the water into wine. Now, this was the kind of commission which one would expect in a Catholic country at the time like this. However, what the Venetian artists do with all of these religious commissions is subvert them into glorification of the city of Venice. So this clearly does not take place where would it be, in Judea? It is clearly in Venice, right? So in the background here we have the Palladian Spear or one of the churches. You have this extraordinary architecture which everyone could see was the architecture of Venice. However, to do the right thing, he has Christ in the centre, but he's not a really significant figure despite the halo. So what this is really about is about a whole number of ambivalent things. It's about the mundane and the theatrical, people pouring wine but actually making a theatre of it. It's about the sort of the profane and the spiritual, and it's also about the East and the West, all right, trying to look at the sumptuousness and the sophistication of Venice. And so what do we have? All right, there's a bit of symbolism. They're killing a lamb above the head of Jesus. This is the sacrifice of the lamb, and there you have Mary with the cup, which will be the wine. But, basically that is all we have. Everybody else is dressed in extraordinary ways, which contrast completely with Jesus' very plain outfit. So what the artist is attempting to do is to foreground one of the things which are the great textiles that, of course, the Venetians wore. All right, these were imported from Byzantium, brought across from all of the great trading ports. Silks, velvets, all of these things are brought into Venice and shipped out to the rest of Europe. So this is being showcased in the extraordinary garment of this man who is probably the brother of Veronese. It's not only that, but this has recently been restored, and the pigments that are used to depict this are pigments which were specifically brought into Venice, very, very expensive ones. For example, lapis lazuli, which cost a fortune. This is why you get these beautiful blues, and the reds as well were very expensive. Not only is it just Venice, the city of sophisticated dining, but also of music. Right, and so to push this home, you actually have 4 people playing what would be a Baroque ensemble, We have Veronese on violone di gamba. We've got Bassoni on flute. You've got Tintoretto on guitar, and I think this is Titian on the bass. Over here we have the bride and groom. I just want to show you. Here we have yes, they're sitting right on the end. And here you have this wonderful mixture of costumes. I don't know what he's looking at, but anyway. Here we have these beautiful costumes, the costumes which relate very much to the East. All right, so you actually, I'll just go back. You have references to, okay, the Palestinians, but also people from all parts of the world. Here you have a little black slave, you've got dwarfs, you've got black, brown and brindles sort of complexions. Venice as the centre, the cosmopolitan hub of the world. And it's not just that, it's also Venice producing beautiful glassware at Murano, and so this is being foregrounded. Beautiful exotic food which is being served. Pearls, of course, which are being highlighted because they come from the sea, and as you'll see, this is very important. And this a pearl necklace was what mothers-in-law gave their daughters-in-law on their wedding, and you'll all probably be quite pleased that that's no longer the case. But if you didn't have the money, you actually sort of would hire one. It's also foregrounding the beauty of Venetian women. They were supposed to have, remember, I think you can get hair dye called Titian red and Veronese, I'm not quite sure, but this particular colour was supposed to be particular to Venetian women. They used to put tea leaves on their hair, and then they had big wide hats and they'd sit in the sun. I'm not quite sure what the tea leaves did, but evidently it produced something very similar to this. And they were quite fair in comparison to what they sort of thought of those swarthy southerners. This then is this showcasing of how Venice wants itself to be seen. And this also, I better move on. So now let's look at some of the other images or myths that Venice produces. First of all, this idea of Venice rising from the sea. There's no other city like this in the world. Now, this is the form that Venice takes today, but originally, just looking at the origins of Venice, they say they were founded in 451 AD. In fact, that archaeologists have found that even the Romans earlier than that had villas out on some of the islands in the lagoon. They've uncovered this. However, when the Western Roman Empire collapsed in about 500 AD, under the pressure of the barbarian hordes, for example, Attila with his Huns, they came to Aquileia on the coast, and many of the Italians there fled out into the lagoon and established themselves on places such as Torcello and in fact at another island called Malmocco, which really is, I don't think there's about one person living there now. There's only 12 who live here now. However, after Attila the Hun left, he didn't want to occupy this part of the world. The Venetians came back, and then it was only under the Lombards, about 100 years later, that they actually settled themselves in the lagoon and set themselves up in the lagoon, not in the part of Venice that we consider Venice today. That actually happens something like about 50 or 60 or even 100 years later. But Torcello was the first major settlement, and at one stage, a lot of you would know it, it had 10,000 people living there. 10,000. And now all you've got is one cathedral, a small church, and a kind of baptistry, and 12 people, and a really nice restaurant where John Clooney had his wedding reception. So apart from that, this is what it's like today. So the fact that it is seated or is situated in the sea meant that the Venetians always incorporated in part of their myth something to do with the sea, because they had an ambivalent relationship to it. On the one hand, it protected them because the lagoon was shallow and it had only only they knew which were the navigable passages, it meant that they were not going to be invaded by sea, right? But also it was treacherous because of these high, tides, the acqua alta, which of course would swamp Malmocco and would swamp Torcello, which is why the cathedral which is there is an 11th century one, because the others were destroyed by these rising tides. All right. Now, originally there was land under the lagoon, and I think it's 2 metres since the 12th century that the lagoon has filled up with water, which is interesting. So this means then that Venice talks about herself as related to the sea. And so we have Tiepolo's wonderful painting of Venice, an allegory of Venice and the sea. And here you have Neptune, or one of the Tritons. In fact, he's got his Triton there, pouring forth the wealth of trade, obviously, at the feet of Venice, with her crown, who's leaning on this dog that looks a bit sort of like a cocker spaniel. All right, but it's Venice placing itself in the pagan mythology, all right, to speak about itself. And this is then taken up by the British later on, who, if you want to ever read anything about Venice, you get these, fulsome trades. For example, Wordsworth waxes lyrical, called On the Extinction of the Venetian Republic. And as we'll see, the grand tourists in the 19th century were there because they wanted to just learn the lessons of what happens to a great maritime empire. What mistakes did it make? Because after all, the British, of course, were the next great maritime empire. So once and you notice that Venice is always referred to as a woman, and there's a kind of slightly eroticized text in which it wouldn't go down for political correctness nowadays. You couldn't write this sort of poetry. Once she did hold the gorgeous East in fee, and was the safeguard of the West. The worth of Venice did not fall below her birth. Venice, the eldest child of liberty, she was maiden city, bright and free. No guile seduced, no force could violate. And when she took unto herself a mate, she must espouse the everlasting sea. All right, so there's this kind of, slightly dicey relationship between Venice and the sea. Now this is perpetuated in the art of the 16th century, 16th, 17th century. And the Venetians, at this time in particular, when they are no longer actually going to continue to be the great masters of the trade routes, masters of the northern part of Italy, go into overdrive to produce these myths to justify its position. So here we have a story which relates to a time when, back in 1177, the Pope Julius II was at war with Frederick Barbarossa. And to cut a very long story short, the Venetians, who have always worked with diplomacy, step in to make peace between the two of them. This was the time when there was an alternate pope in Avignon and so on. And so in gratefulness to this, because the Doge of Venice gets the two of them to meet in Venice and acts as arbiter. So this is, theoretically, this is when the Pope offers the Doge the sword and this ring, which is going to figure greatly in ceremonies that even take place today. And with this ring gave them sovereignty over the Adriatic. Right. Now, this now becomes the day of the censer of the Ascension. In other words, they're now, whenever Venice actually has a festival, it tends to relate to the Virgin Mary. She was founded on the day of the Annunciation. This is the Ascension of Mary, the 15th of August. And so there's a massive ceremony which took place every year until Napoleon sort of literally gutted the ship, where this amazing ship called the Bucintoro, covered in damask and velvet, with all of the noble families sitting there with the Doge on a throne clasping the ring. Cannons would fire. He would go out from the Doge's palace surrounded by all of these extraordinary little ships, or everyone would be there decked in their finest, go out into the lagoon, be blessed by the Patriarch of Aquileia, and the Patriarch who's actually at St. Peter's of Costello, and go out and throw the ring into the sea, saying, "We wed thee, sea, in token of our perpetual rule." Right? This ceremony was reinstated relatively recently as some extra thing to bring tourists and the ships to Rome, to Venice. And so here we have William Collins also waxing eloquent. "Strike louder, strike the ennobling strings of those whose merchant sons were kings. To him who decked with pearly pride in Adria weds his green-haired bride. Hail, port of glory, wealth and pleasure." Now you've actually got the gender, dare we talk gender actually inversed here. But the main thing is that, of course, it is a marriage between Venice and the sea. Now, Venice always had an eye to its public persona, and in the Middle Ages, a city that didn't have relics or powerful relics was a non-entity. It would not have pilgrims coming to visit it, and pilgrims, again, of course, are tourists. And so Venice, there are two reasons why Venice is going to take, or the pious theft is going to take place, where Venice steals the bones of St. Mark. Now, when you actually come into Venice, you will see these two pillars. On one of them you have a rather puny character standing on what looks like a crocodile, and over here we have what looks like a winged lion. Now this, of course, the winged lion is the symbol of St. Mark. It comes from the book of the Apocalypse, in the book of Revelations, when you see the images of the four apostles. Now, St. Theodore was the original patron saint of Venice. And this related to the fact that Venice, up until about the 800s, really was part of the Byzantine Empire. All right, so all this story about, defeating armies and things on the water by the grace of God, in fact it was the grace of the Byzantines. However, as Venice grew more powerful and Byzantium was weakened and they really didn't have the ability to rule them from afar, Venice decides that it's going to break away from the thrall of Byzantium and do away with, or cast into a secondary role, this Byzantine saint, who was a warrior saint. And so they decide that it's going to be St. Mark. Now, St. Mark, there was a legend that St. Mark had been caught in a storm as he was going across the lagoon, and an angel had come to him and said, "Pax tibi apostoli me," peace to you, Mark, my apostle. And this was read by the Venetians as saying that he must come to rest finally in the lagoon. There was also a consensus that St. Mark had certainly proselytised and converted many of the people in that part of Italy, and the bishopric of Aquileia was second only to the Pope at the time. So Venetians sent out two thieves, because the real problem with all of this was that poor old St. Mark had been buried, for something like 8 centuries in Alexandria. So two thieves are sent out to grab the bones. Now here you have this, in the most dramatic way of Tintoretto, representing the sort of bravery of our boys going in and getting rid of the body. Now the body is in a remarkable state considering it's 800 years old, but you've got all of this extraordinary, thunder and lightning, but it doesn't look very much like Alexandria, does it? It's really very much sort of in Venice. So here is the body of St. Mark being brought in. And the way in which they managed to get it out of Alexandria was, of course, because these people were Muslims and wouldn't touch pork, and so they put the body was put underneath a whole pile of pork chops, and such is biblical legend. As you can see here, the Muslims saying no, I couldn't possibly turn up the chops to look underneath. So St. Mark and the pork chops arrive in Venice, and he is immediately placed in a chapel near the Doge's palace. not in the cathedral at San Costello. So in other words, it's the Doge and it's the Venice which now control the relics, not the church, right? So that's a really interesting point. This is actually on the outside of St. Mark's, on the left-hand side. Now, this story, which has been woven about St. Mark, continues to be dramatised. Here we have Bordone with another wonderful story about St. Mark. So there was a poor gondolier, this is the poor gondolier here, minding his own business when suddenly there's a storm in the lagoon and 3 people get into his gondola. And one of them has a beard and has a majestic cape and looked like someone from the church. And the other 2 had capes, but from the swishing sound of the silk against something underneath it, he thought they must be warriors. All right. So the poor gondola and these 3 people go out and do battle all night with monsters that arrive from the sea, and at dawn they have vanquished them. He comes back, St. Mark, it turns out it was St. Mark, disappears and goes up to the top of St. Mark's, where he was. The others were St. Theodore and St. George. So St. George goes back to San Giorgio and St. Theodore goes back on top of his stela, all right? But before this happens, the man is given a ring and he presents it to the Doge. The Doge looks and sees that indeed the ring had been stolen, but there are guards all around it. It must have been a miraculous thing that had happened. All right, so you see in which they sort of now are literally inventing their own connections to the Bible. Now, it's good to have all these legends, but if you have to just have them stuck in a book, no one is going to know about them. And so what happens with Venice is that they develop all of these legends and produce them like theatrical performances. So in other words, they wear their history on the outside, right? It's an extroverted form of history. And this, I think, is a very good example of these processions, these huge processions which would be months in planning and which would take place in St. Mark's Square. Now, I just wanted to very briefly look at the way in which this is, of course, Canaletto, who develops this view of Venice, which may never have existed. I mean, topographically, it's impossible. I mean, where would he have been standing to actually get a view like that? So they're all, even though it looks like like an architect's drawing, in actual fact it's not. It's completely exaggerated. The way in which Venice was constructed is almost like an outdoor theatre, and in fact, I will put it to you that St. Mark's Square and the buildings on either side, which were developed during the Renaissance, are very much like the inside of a church. So in other words, all this area, rather than being a square, could be seen like a gigantic church with this St. Mark's like a beautiful altar piece, all right? It's all in gold with statues of the Virgin Mary and statues of the saints, pictures of the history of Venice, in mosaics with all these wonderful onion domes, which are so exotic. And in most churches then you process towards the altar, but of course you have aisles, and so on either side here you actually have this emerging from dark and light, dark and light, dark and light. You actually march, it pulls you towards the altar. And indeed what is in this altar, it's the relics of St. Mark. So this then was a perfect space in which to produce or develop these myths about their own beginnings. So this is the procession of the Corpus Christi, beautifully choreographed. There's no pushing and shoving. Everyone in sort of extraordinarily matched costumes and so on. But it wasn't just religious processions which were beautifully set out, but also political ones. Now, I think it's about 1500, this was when this was painted, and it was very briefly after the time, Venice was in a decline, was losing its ports in the Adriatic, and so was desperate to set itself up in Cyprus, which was, the pirates were attacking their ships and they wanted a headquarters down there. And so the only way to do this was to, this young girl, Katarina Cornaro, who was considered very beautiful, she was adopted by the city of Venice. Right? So she becomes the daughter of Venice. Right? And she is then sent out to marry a slightly doddery King Robert of Cyprus, who conveniently dies a few years later, and leaving Cyprus, or the crown of Cyprus, to his dear wife. And so Venice then bring her back, and since she is the daughter of Venice, Venice inherits the kingdom of Cyprus, right? And so here she is. So this is a painting which celebrates her returning, and this magnificent ship, with all flags flying, and so she is being helped ashore. Now this was then commemorated every year. And it is still commemorated today, where you have the September regatta. Some of you would have seen this, where they all get dressed up in amazing costumes and flog themselves up and down the Grand Canal. I think they actually compete against Genoa and Amalfi and so on. So, and then of course, this is using the Grand Canal as a theatrical space. I mean, what could be better, with these amazing buildings, which you actually see twice because they're reflected in the water, and so on. The other great festival, which is now people flock to see, of course, is the Festa of the Redentore. Venice was plagued by plague, I was going to say, underwent a number of outbreaks of the plague. The one in 1576, a third of the population died. This is when Titian dies. And the Church of the Redentore, the Redeemer, is built to give thanks for the end of the plague. And so on the day of the Redeemer, ships or small barges are set up, and it connects the Giudecca, Dorso Duro, with the Zattere, actual fact Zattere, with the Giudecca across there, and it's celebrated by magnificent fireworks. So you can see that even today Venice is still turning on these spectacular events, as it did all throughout its history. People could not believe how amazing it was. But they continued the artists constantly reference their own city, even when they are referring to biblical events. And this is Bellini, of course, one of the early painters of the 1500s. Here, this references this is the bridge of San Lorenzo. All of the notable people are here. This is when someone, I think, of the cross falls into the water, and one of the brethren jumps in, and here he is floating and with the piece of the true cross. At a time when no one could swim and he had all his cassocks on, it really was a miracle that he managed to survive. But in fact, this is really not foregrounded much. What you actually see here is Venice, right? This is what this painting is about. This miracle of the true cross, true spots. I mean, who cares? Look at Venice. And so here we have these wonderful chimneys, which of course were built like that because if the cinders fell down, there was a lot of wooden infrastructure, the city would burn. In fact, the city did burn a number of times. So this was characteristic of Venice, and these wonderful, slightly Byzantine, Gothico-Byzantine windows, and buildings all around. And I just want to show you, that's what the San Lorenzo Bridge looks like today. So this is where, those of you who are Donna Leon fans, Spectre Brunetti always hangs out in a coffee shop, which gives you, it's getting worse and worse, the coffee. Every time she produces a book, more and more people come. But you can see very much the way in which, unfortunately, this other one has been built behind. Another one, which is again about Venice, is the miracle of the True Cross. This time the True Cross has been trotted out to cure a madman. But you look in vain for the madman, and you finally find him, he's almost out of the picture plane, and he's over here being cured by, placing his hand on the True Cross. The centre of the painting is Venice, all right? And what part of Venice? incredibly urban city with these wonderful chimneys coming out, the bridges, all of these marvellous boats with highly sophisticated clothing, black oarsmen, you've got dwarfs. It really, again, is a celebration of the cosmopolitan nature of the city. And again, this is with Carpaccio, even in his St. Ursula cycle, this is in the Academia, where he's painting the story of St. Ursula, who's supposed to take place in Britain, and then in Rome, and then in Munich, I think it is, but nowhere near Venice. But of course, what do we get in the background? It is Venetian architecture. All right, so the Venetians could not see beyond their own city and also wanted to integrate it into these great narrative biblical cycles. I just wanted to then look at the feast day of St. Roch. Now, this is actually Canaletto who paints this. On the feast day of St. Roch, now St. Rocco was, of course, another saint that the Venetians had stolen. He was a French saint from Montpellier. He was credited with having his ruins were supposed to help you with the plague, cure the plague. He had been helped by his dog. And so there's a whole scuola, or what do you call these buildings which are set up, fraternity buildings set up to look after the people of the fraternity of St. Roch. They provided ambulances, they provided dowries for girls, and so on. So this is when, on the feast day of St. Roch, celebrating the end of the plague, you get a marvellous procession with the Doge, and they're all holding nosegays. Can you see that? Because, of course, this idea was that if you had a wonderful smell in front of you, this would in some way protect you from the plague. This was this idea that germs were transmitted by miasmas. Now, Canaletto, actually, there was an art show. There you go, Prue. There was an art show which was put on at the time. And so Canaletto is actually depicting his own work in this. It's actually quite interesting. So here's St. Roch ascending up to heaven. He always is seen with showing his sore on his leg. And this, of course, is the Church of St. Rocco, and this is where you have those wonderful series of Tintorettos. You would all know those. All right, so Venice now has all of these myths supporting herself, and she now uses the name to refer to herself as the most serene one. And it's quite funny, actually. My nickname at university in the French department was La Serenissima, because I was anything but, I was always making a scene, evidently, at meetings. But anyhow, so they'd ask, what does a Serenissima think? Anyway, I don't really identify with Venice. All right, so in 1578, we have Venice now changing from being the bellicose conqueror to being the diplomatic sort of centre of Europe. And what happens at the League of Cambrai is that the Pope is worried that Venice is expanding to the Papal States. The Pope enlists the help of the French, the Spanish, the Holy Roman Empire, and various other city-states that were very threatened by the Venetians. And they set out to take back the land round Bergamo, Vicenza, Verona, all of this Mantua, right down to there, was being threatened by Venice in a land grab. And they actually take back much of this land. Venice is defeated in the first battle, but then by her diplomacy, and this is again how Venice works, she manages to put a wedge between this gets complicated, between the Pope and the French. And the Pope then sides with Venice against France and Austria and Spain. Spain drops out because they've got what they wanted. The Austrians don't want to continue. And then Venice manages to annex the French, who are more important than the Pope. And then there's a treaty between the French and the Venetians, which ends up meaning that Venice manages, by diplomacy, to get back all of the land that it lost during those first battles. The Venetians weren't great land conquerors because they didn't really have an army. They had to rely on what they called condottieri, who were mercenaries. And some of them were brilliant. for example, the one who's Corleone, who's in the outside St. Mark's. So this then is a painting which refers to the great victory of Venice. And in actual fact, you know, Venice really hadn't had a great battle victory at all. So here you have Venice with her sword and the lion running at, and blessed by the Doge, victory coming down with a wreath, running at the Holy Roman Emperor here, whose symbol was a bull. All right, so here you have the lion combating the bull, and the victory of Venice, and in the background, of course, you see all of these city-states which were basically being fought over. It's no longer maritime states that are in the background. It's at this time that the ducal palace is redecorated. It might have been burnt down, and of course they call on the great artists of this time to depict all of these images and all of these myths, so that when the ambassadors and when the great other heads of Europe come through, they sit there beneath these extraordinary depictions of the wealth and the greatness of Venice. And here we have Tintorettos Paradise. You actually would have had the Doge sitting down here, just between the Virgin Mary and Christ, all of this round here. He's sort of seen as being the most powerful person apart from these people in paradise. Now, Venice now develops herself as a kind of, as Venus and Virgin and as Victory. It's quite convenient that they all begin with V. Well, we've looked at Venice as Venus, right? Venice rising from the sea, like the, you know, in the Greek and Roman myth. But now we need to look at Venice as the Virgin Mary, and they continue to sort of push this association because they continue to say that they were founded on the day of the Annunciation, so that in every cycle of paintings in Venice, you are always going to have the Annunciation definitely there. And here we have, actually this is by Tintoretto, I think it's an absolute hoot. You've got Mary minding her own business in a nice clean kitchen, and suddenly you've got like 28 angels bursting in through the wall. I mean, that's the dusting, I mean, after that. So we now then have Venice being seen as having an intimate connection with not just the Virgin Mary, but with the Christ child as well, because they were founded on the day of conception, right? So here you have Venice seen as one of these beautiful Venetian women with the pearls, the fair hair, the fair skin. And if you'd like to look very much at the other, there's a painting I actually meant to put in where you actually have St. Catherine, the sacred wedding of St. Catherine with touching the Christ child. It's basically iconographically almost identical, but instead of St. Catherine, you've actually got Venice. And this means that because she's related, Venice is conceived on the day of the Annunciation, you're going to actually have references to the Annunciation everywhere. So on the corners here you have Mary, and over there you have, or the other way around, you have Gabriel. On the Rialto Bridge, my eyesight isn't very good. Is that Gabriel or Mary? I think it's Mary. She's kneeling, and on the other, yes, on the other side you have Gabriel announcing it. So Venice really is a city of angels. There are angels in the architecture, literally. Venice here is seen now. Venice, the depiction of Venice, the allegorical figure of Venice, who is an opulent blonde woman, replaces then the Virgin Mary in many of the great paintings that are going to be produced at this time for the ducal palace. So here you have the triumph of Venice, that here's someone tumbling down with the crown, but here you have the triumph of Venice. Now, to the grand tourists, the English Protestants who came along, they were completely bamboozled that this, in fact, is Venice. They would have thought it was the Virgin Mary, all right? Now, this is a typical Assumption painting where you have three levels. You have the world, you have Mary who's transitioning, and you have heaven. So here but in this case, here you have the Venetians, who are all down here, actually like being at a theatre, they're standing looking up. Then you've got Venice on a cloud floating upwards, and here is the celestial sphere, and instead of God the Father and the Holy Ghost crowning Mary, you have actually ancient goddesses doing the same thing. So there she is, looking very much like the Virgin Mary. And I want to give you this example. This was painted in 1585. In 1515 to 1518, Titian produces this painting in the Friary Church. A lot of you have seen this with me. Here you have the disciples underneath, looking amazed. His arm goes up. There she is. The Virgin Mary is being pushed upwards on the clouds into the heavenly spheres with God the Father. So it's exactly the same iconography as the one of Venice. And here it is. This is the one as you walk down the aisle. It sort of gradually comes into perspective. It's the most amazing experience walking towards that. We have another one with Palma Giovane. You also have Palma Vecchio, who is his father, who specialises in this. Here we have again the Venice is crowned by victory. So now it's even though they were using a kind of Christian iconography, they're inserting pagan elements. So here you have victory, the goddess of victory crowning Venice, and the standards are being shown to her, and here are the defeated down here. I just wanted to show you another one of Titian's in the Friary Church, which is constructed on the same way with the the people, earthly beings at the base, going upwards towards the Virgin Mary and salvation above. Can you see the way in which that's being constructed on the same format? And then, of course, then you get Veronese, who goes the whole way with Venice enthroned between justice and peace. So they've really got pulling out every possible stop, using ancient pagan myths, symbolism, and Christian iconography as well. Here we have more Juno showering gifts on Venice. We now have depictions of Venice in the 18th century. Now, in the 18th century, by now, Venice has entered its decline, right? It hasn't got many more years before Napoleon will dissolve it. Remember, in 1797 or 95, I'm not sure, he marches on Venice. So Venice, in that period, where it's shrinking from the land and from the sea and in prestige. And so it reinvents itself as the entertainment capital of the world in many ways. Venice is sophisticated in theatre, music, all of the arts, and its courtesans were renowned as well. So this is one of the theatres which were built by private families, right? I mean, remember that the Council of Venice is made up of these aristocratic families whose names are in the Golden Book, and they still have enough money at this stage to be able to set up their own theatres. This one actually still operates, and this began in the 17th century to put on operas. Now, opera was a form which developed in Florence, but just at the end of the sort of supremacy of Florence had entered a decline, and it's going to be Venice who is going to take it on and present the art form to the world. And of course Vivaldi will be instrumental in this, and I just want to talk about something which is, those of you who've been to Venice with me will know this, but something which was considered quite extraordinary were these orphan choirs. Now, the orphan choirs, there were around, I'll get back to that, around Venice, 4 main hospitals which had been set up with the wonderful names of the derelict, the incurables, the beggars. This was the derelict one. And they took in orphans of the plague, orphans from the perpetual wars that Venice was waging. And originally they were hospitals for people who were incurable, but gradually they become more and more to specialise in the hospitals for girls. And they become orphanages for girls. And the girls then are taken in at a very young age and auditioned and then split into those who are musically gifted and those who aren't. And those who aren't are taught a trade, for example, lace making or mending or cleaning, and they're given a small dowry and then sent out into the world, because a girl who didn't have a dowry couldn't marry. All that men were interested in was your money. And they couldn't even enter a convent because you had to also pay to get a dowry for a convent. So by giving them a dowry, it would mean they would not have to resort to prostitution. Those girls who remained, the other group of girls, were then trained to the highest degree of musicianship in singing and in playing different instruments. And the city of Venice and the patrons of these so-called hospitals got the cutting-edge instruments throughout the world and commissioned the great composers such as Vivaldi to compose for these girls. So you get this wonderful, I don't know if you know it, called Judith Triumphant, Judita Triumphans, where you have the 4 levels of voices, which originally one would expect for a bass and then a contralto and then a tenor. Well, when it's for girls' voices, it's different, but they weave the voices from contraltos to mezzo-sopranos and sopranos and the very high sopranos, and weave these wonderful sort of melodic structures. And they became so famous that, well, first of all, they couldn't marry, right? They had to actually live not exactly a recluse life, because they were allowed to perform in churches. And people came throughout Europe to these different, the derelict, the mendicanti, or the incurables, and there was rivalry between them. Oh, I heard Josepha from the incurables, is she as good as Maria Louisa from the... And so they were written about in the papers, but no one could ever see them. And they performed in the churches, which are built behind screens near the altar. And so for the first time you actually have people singing unseen, and then around the church from other screens you would have other girls playing very high level of musical instruments. So it was almost as though there were the voices of angels. People, we're used to surround sound, but this was considered absolutely amazing. These girls could actually marry, and indeed some of them married into the aristocracy, but if they married, when they were married, they were given a very large dowry. However, they were never allowed to perform again. If they ever performed again, even to a soiree like this, their dowry would be taken away. So this then is why we have this. You have, this has actually got, it looks as though you can see the girls there, but in one of the places we visited, I'm not sure whether we did, was a little church near the Mendicanti. This is actually what is the hospital now. This was the beggars' hospital, and it's now the Hospital of Venice. Mm-hmm. And it hasn't changed. Well, on one of my tours, a lady got pneumonia, and I had to put her in the hospital. And I walked out, and there's all these statues. I thought, this looks familiar. And of course, it is literally a Renaissance hospital, and the level of care was a bit Renaissance as well. Don't get sick in Venice. All right, so here we have Rio de Mendicanti. Now, music then was something which Venice became renowned for. Here we have Longhi, who now is going to develop, instead of the era of the great religious glorifications and allegories of Venice is over. Venice is now going to present itself as a place of the arts, sophistication, and so on. And so Longhi produces these interiors where people play. And of course, what was amazing about Venice was, of course, the carnival. This idea of people from Boxing Day right through till Mardi Gras, isn't it, or Shrove Tuesday, I think it's something like 2 months, wore masks, and in fact you couldn't interrupt this time of festivity. One of the Doges actually died, and no one sort of basically put him in a back room until the carnival was over. Nobody wanted to have to stop and go into mourning. But people wore masks, and this is sort of this, again, this sense of this mystery, this magical mystery tour. Nowhere else in Europe did one wear masks during the day or indeed at night. And of course it meant this ambiguity. People, you didn't know who you were talking to, theoretically. I mean, you know, whether it was a man or a woman and so on. So Venice then develops itself as a gambling hub. Like the Crown Casino in masks back in the 18th century. But also these paintings forward this idea of this sophisticated take on religion also. All right, here we have the convent of San Zaccaria, which is just behind the Doge's palace. And here you can see, this is the nuns' parlour. The nuns, theoretically behind a screen, they often weren't, dressed in beautiful dresses. You know, they were usually, in fact, many of them at San Zaccaria were daughters of aristocratic families. By now, because trade had collapsed, it meant that the families couldn't pay dowries for all of their daughters. So they paid a lesser dowry and they entered a convent, which of course meant that there were obviously people who had a calling, but many of them didn't, and they mixed together. So here, of course, you have them living it up. They've got a puppet show. They have beautiful rooms covered in tapestries and velvets, chatting on to their friends, and they're being handed sweetmeats and so on. This was a notorious convent. I mean, even Casanova managed to penetrate the convent, and there were a number of children born. There's actually a place where the babies were thrown into the sea. There's actually a reference now. There's a plaque outside the Pietà which refers to this, saying that if you're caught disposing of children, what will happen to you. But again, Longhi again continues to create the myth of the mystique of Venice and the cosmopolitan nature. So here you have a lady being given a love letter, clearly, by a black servant who looks extremely exotic. Now, the Venetians had a very liberal view of marriage. I mean, one married to have some children to carry on the family name, but after that, that was it. And everyone agreed with that. And in fact, they were quite amazed when some of them went to Paris and they saw men going out to the theatre with their wives, and they thought this was incredibly plebeian and bourgeois. Whereas most women had, I think it was called a Chisbi, who was a well-known lover, who was often the best mate of her husband. In fact, all three of them would go out together. So it was extremely lax sort of form. So you can imagine that the English grand tourists simply had a heart attack when they arrived and wondered how they could get in on the act. All right, so then of course we have these wonderful things. Now, by the 17th or the 18th century, you have a whole lot of little local festivals which are now set up to attract and entertain. They talk about the history of Venice, but they also are there to amuse all of these grand tourists and amuse the people who are now coming to Venice. Now, there's a particular painter called Bella. Now, the reason this is a rather grainy slide is it's very, very difficult to find reproductions of his work. Here you have the bridge of fists or fisticuffs, and this is what, of course, all young men do well, go out and beat each other up. And so at one stage of the year you would have people from Castello, over in the right-hand side, the southeast corner of Venice, against those from Dorsoduro, and they had a conflicting fight. People would be killed. People would stand in their windows on roofs watching as people were pushed off into the water. Unfortunately, I think that's a dog that's going in there. Here is the Ponte delle Pugne today. So I think this is what's so interesting about Venice, is that you actually can go back. If you look at all of these propaganda paintings, you can go and visit these places. And it's looking a little bit the worse for wear, and you wonder how anyone died falling down that far. But I suppose you have to remember people couldn't swim. There's also the Festival of the Marias at Santa Maria Formosa, and this was referencing a day when the Doge gave dowries to, I think it was 12 beautiful girls who were called the Marias. And on one particular occasion, some pirates came in and stole the dowries and stole the girls as well. And so the local young thugs went out and got the dowries and the girls back. And so this now is then celebrated as the Festival of the Marias. And this is, I think, appalling testimony of people's, what people considered entertainment at this time. Most of it was centred around torturing animals. Here you have a dog up here, or a cat who's actually, I think it's having its belly scraped with a comb. Then you had to run along here, and there was a duck, and you pulled its neck. And then over here, you could, if that wasn't enough, you watched bull baiting. Bear baiting is being set, and you've got bull fighting over there. All right, so you still have bullfights in Spain. People go and see them. So let's think we're too sophisticated. All right, but that's outside Santa Maria Formosa, and this is actually what it looks like today. There's no bull baiting there anymore. Now, we now come to the 17th and 18th century, the time of the grand tourists, and in particular we're going to look at the way Ruskin sees Venice. Now, the grand tourists, as I said, were this elite of young Englishmen who went across and spent several years honing their skills, theoretically becoming fluent in Italian. That was ridiculous. All they did was frequent other young tourists. But the idea was that they garnered an education. It started at a time when the university system really wasn't working very well. These young men had to be taken away from the petticoats of their mother and turned into men. And so tutors were hired, and who was called a bear leader. And the bear leader would take his charge from one city to another. And the main destiny or the destination of the Grand Tour was Rome, to see the horrors of Catholicism, and Venice, to see the horrors of vice. And when you were in these particular cities, you had to have some kind of proof that you'd been there. And so they would sit to different types of portraitists. In Rome, you would sit to Pompeo Battoni, who has actually a grand tourist painting is in our gallery. When they were in Venice, they would sit to Rosalba Carriera. And here, what is attempting to be depicted is Gustavus Hamilton, the second Viscount Boyne, having pushed aside, you see, he's actually dressed in the sumptuous robes of a Venetian, right, not in the sort of, the sort of things Englishmen would be wearing, but he has been able to take part in the carnival. This time of orgies, of sensuality, of time of great ambivalence, no one knowing who was who or what was what. And he's managed to take part in that. He's pushed it aside, and the real, true young Englishman has emerged from beneath. So this is a real propaganda painting. So of course, this would be then hanged, placed in the hall of his ancestral home. And this is what Charles Baldwin said about it in 1800. This is what Venice was like. From liberty to libertine to licentiousness. They enjoy a sort of liberty, but it's only to be libertines, and they grow so scandalous that I think their whole city may well be termed the brothel of Europe. And I dare say that virtue was never so out of countenance or vice so encouraged in any part of the world, nor in any time as at this time in Venice. And so here we have Venice as a city of courtesans. I'm going to have to move on a bit. And the problem was, when these people were actually looking back at the art of Venice, they couldn't always tell between a courtesan and a saint. And so here we have St. Barbara, who's with her tower, and here we have one of the well-known courtesans, both painted by good old Palma Vecchio, looking more or less identical, except she doesn't hold the tower and she's got her hair down. So I mean, this ambiguity about everything in Venice. So Venice, however, was perceived as the prototype of Great Britain, that it was unconquered and independent for 1,000 years. That's what the British believed. Of course, that was not true, but the myth, Venice had so carefully spun its myth that it was believed, and still is, It was a great maritime power, like the British Empire. What happened? Right, withstands papal pressure to bow from Rome. Indeed it did. The Venetians always were very sceptical about the popes, and they manipulated as much as they could. And so the Grand Tourists saw them as kind of proto-Protestants. And it also, of course, had a mixed government based on aristocratic families, all right? So the British saw themselves as great, that Venice had many lessons to show Great Britain. And so people thronged to Venice. And the first thing one did was, after having had one's portrait, one needed a postcard. You didn't have a smartphone or a video or anything like that. You had to go to a painter to get these visions of Venice. And of course the person everyone went to was Canal, whose father actually had been someone who designed stage scenery, which means that Canal actually probably worked with the camera oscura. He was used to setting up theatrical views, right? He was a great friend of the British consul who promoted him to the British who came there. And so he had a magnificent studio set up with a whole group or a stable of young men, and the tourists would come along and they'd say, look, I'll have one of doing this and one of that, and they would go back and frame the doorways of the great stately homes of England. So they would often get a set, and so here you would have Canal's the Riva degli Schiavoni. Do you know where we are? I mean, it's the Doge's Palace. So you're standing here, so you'd have that on one side of your mantelpiece, and then if you looked the other way, you would go down and you would look out to the Salute, Santa Maria della Salute. All right, so you have pairs. And all of these paintings had to have water in it, because of course this was what made Venice so different, so spectacular, and why you wanted it on your walls, right? And in fact there are no Canaletto in the Accademia. I think there's one architectural drawing that he did very early on. All the rest of them basically belong in England. It was consumed enormously by the grand tourists. Also you have Guardi, who does the same sort of thing but with more finesse, in my opinion. Now what happens is that there's a war breaks out between on the continent, and the English tourists can't get across to go to Italy, so Canaletto goes to England and continues to ply his trade there. Here we have Westminster Bridge with a boat not unlike the Bucentoro, and all of these little gondolas.
Is Westminster Bridge that long?
Well, I don't know. I don't know much about London. Or maybe they elongated. And so it becomes a type. And so you get Marlowe actually painting this Capriccio of London, where you actually have St Paul's sort of stuck in the middle of Venice, right? So this was sort of the sophistication, the sort of mingling of aristocratic codes, of artistic license and so on. So Venice is then imported. I will have to sort of go a little bit quicker than this. Palladio, for example, we've seen at the San Giorgio. We saw the Redentore, who's the great Renaissance architect who worked on a theory of harmonies, of musical harmonies for his rooms. I mean, the room had to be I think if you work with strings with 2 to 5, that was the proportion of the height to the sides and so on. Anyhow, it was very clearly worked out. And when the grand tourists came home, this is another one of his villas that he does, you actually get Merryworth House, of course, that many of the great homes in England are based on the Palladian style. Well, we now have the end of the Republic after Napoleon has been through, and the 19th century take on it. And this is a very important time for the myth of Venice. Here you have Byron and Shelley, the romantics who go through. Byron escaping some of his mistresses, but in Mary Shelley's half-sister was his mistress and had produced a child, Allegra, and she was hot in pursuit of Byron. Byron actually places the poor little girl in a convent in Venice, and she dies. So you have Byron actually spends quite a bit of time in Venice with a kind of menagerie of animals. He has an eagle and a couple of peacocks and a mangy monkey on the Grand Canal. He swims the Grand Canal. He's seen as a great phenomenon because, of course, he limped, so therefore swimming was, something he could take part in and excel. And he also went out to the Armenian monastery out on one of the, I think it was the Lazaretto, out one of the islands out near Torcello, and actually wrote a dictionary of Armenian. I mean, he didn't waste his time. Now, at this time also, you have Joseph Turner, all right, the great English landscape, coming to Venice, and you'll see that he is taken very much by the myth of the floating city. All right, here you see Santa Maria della Salute just sort of hovering over the water. And as time goes on, this myth is reinforced. The atmosphere becomes more important. The city barely emerges, as you can see. By 1839, Venice is literally a mirage city until it virtually disappears. And of course, this is going to, of course, inspire the Impressionists years later. But the person who is most inspired by Turner is the art critic John Ruskin. Now, Ruskin had come, one of the books that he'd been given by his parents was a book that actually had reproductions of Turner's work, and he's enchanted by it. And it is this myth of Venice that he has in his head when he visits Venice for the first time. When he actually writes his great Stones of Venice, he actually says, "Yes, Mr. Turner, we are in Venice now." Now, he actually went and lived in Venice for extended periods of time, took his poor young wife with him, never managed to consummate the marriage, and finally she ran off with the person who actually painted him here, John Everett Millais, which is quite ironic. However, if you haven't read some of the Stones of Venice, it is a key work, lyrical work, of a plea to save Venice before it goes forever. And it says, "I would endeavour to trace the lines of this image forever before it be forever lost, and to record, as far as I may, the warning which seems to be uttered by every one of the fast-gaining waves that beat like passing bells against the stones of Venice." You can hear the waves. And it's, when you read it, it's rather turgid prose, but if you read it aloud, it is mesmerising. He really was a poet. And he didn't just write about it, he actually actively went out and did what I think ADFAS is doing, isn't it? Going to different churches and recording all of the different things that are there in case that it disappears. So he went and sketched every main and measured every main facade, and became absolutely enchanted with medieval architecture, or architecture which predates the Renaissance. Now, Ruskin had the idea that the satanic mills of London, from which he had come, were the result of the commercial development of the banks and the industrialisation that he thought went back to the Renaissance. So he disliked anything Palladian and of the Renaissance, and began this cult of the first person really to actually look at this as not just a hodgepodge of domes, but as something to be studied as beautiful in its own right. He was particularly fascinated by what he considered like the incrustations on the facades of Venetian buildings. He sort of saw them almost like like shells, the way in which shells come up on the shore. That was what Venice was like, and this is what it had done with its architecture. And he also says, the Stones of Venice, "Since first the dominion of men was asserted over the ocean, 3 thrones of mark beyond all others have been set upon its sands. The thrones of Tyre, Venice, and England." Right, here we come, this is the main point. "Of the first of these great powers only the memory remains, of the second the ruin. The third, which inherits their greatness, if it forget their example, may be led through prouder eminence to less pitied destruction." So this is what the British were looking at Venice for, to see Venice as a city in decadence. Why had it decayed? Could they, as the great power who were going to take on the mantle of Venice, could they avoid the mistakes that had taken place? So this then was the third myth of Venice. I'm almost finishing. It's gone from Venice, the magical city, to the melancholy city of the Romantics, to the mirage, threatened treasure of the 19th century. And I think we inherit all of those myths. Now, Whistler comes across, and Whistler is an arch enemy of Ruskin. They had a terrible split about his painting. Ruskin told him it was rubbish. Whistler threw an ink pot at him. He was basically ostracised, and finally the Venetians, he gets a scholarship to go and study in Venice, and he produces the different type of Venice. He refuses to do the great, buildings of Venice because his enemy Ruskin had done all that. So you get, and he never identifies his works of art, so that people won't go there and destroy them. He didn't really have much money. He was painting on coloured pieces of cardboard. We also have Singer Sargent, who goes across at the same time and also paints the minore, Venezia minore, a minor view of Venice. Venice seen from boats, Venice looking up, again a cross between the little, out-of-the-way canals of Whistler and that of Ruskin. So Venice continued right from about 800 AD through all of these centuries up until today to weave this extraordinary magic that pulls you in. And you actually look at paintings like this, when you look at Tiepolos and you see these beautiful pinks and oranges and blues, and you sort of think, well, it's a bit of an exaggeration. And then you actually get down at the Grand Canal just as twilight is about to fall and as the lights start to twinkle. And it is really an extraordinary place. I mean, on the last tour I was there, we were waiting to go in to listen to Mass at St Mark's, and it started to rain, and you could see all of this pink and green buildings floating through the rain. It was one of those experiences I will actually never forget. So this then is basically the ability of a city to narrate and create its image and to have it altered and for it still to be extraordinarily potent nowadays. Voilà, thank you.